Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Cherry Audio Mercury-6 tutorial series. I'm going to complete our examination of the top row of controls of the synth today by having a look at the low frequency oscillators. If you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon or channel member links below. It's a great way to do it. Now I say top level controls, and we will complete those top controls as well, but there are actually two low frequency oscillators in this machine. We'll have a look at LFO2 as well. LFO1 first. So a low frequency oscillator, as we've discussed previously, is simply something that cycles slowly. It's as simple as that. And its purpose is to periodically perform a modulation on some other feature in the synthesizer. The easiest demonstration is almost always pitch, and we have an LFO modulation of pitch to play with. So in the VCO, the oscillator modulation section, this is telling us that we're going to be modulating or changing the pitch of the oscillator. If I increase LFO1 to about halfway and press a note, quite clearly see and hear a change of pitch going on there, and the rate is governed by this flashing light you can see up above. It's in sync with that modulation, and obviously this is where we control that rate. If you really crank this up high, you get a completely different effect. You can no longer hear each individual oscillation, and it becomes an entirely different effect. Kind of raspy, much more modern sounding, I suppose. This is the basis of FM synthesis that's basically been prevalent throughout synthesizers for the last 40 years, but we'll keep it at slow rates for today. We can delay the onset of that low frequency oscillation with the delay slider. So at its maximum, it's going to delay for 2.5 seconds, and it won't be a sudden introduction from nothing to full. It will basically be ramped up. But in the Mercury-6, as with the original Jupiter-6, it's actually a pretty fast ramp. Here we go. No oscillation. And then it picks up pretty quickly, and you've got this quite fast uptick. If I bring my rate up as well a little bit, you can generate something that's got a really natural feel to it, where somebody plays a note and it's stable, and then the oscillation is introduced, and it sounds very much like a human performer would play if they were playing an acoustic instrument. So that's the first form of modulation that LFO1 can have. Let's turn that off and go over to the second one. Pulse width modulation is the ability to periodically control the width of a pulse wave, which is why it's no accident that we started today with a pulse wave dialed in, so that I can demonstrate this easily. Now, by default, this control is mapped to the low frequency oscillator. You can see we've got a toggle switch here. So if I introduce some pulse width modulation, slow it down, quite clearly see the pulse of the wave being modulated over time. Just as a matter of interest, because I haven't actually directly addressed this toggle switch in this tutorial series, I'll just jump over to envelope 1, and if I crank in some attack on envelope 1, now you can see envelope 1 doing exactly the same thing. This is a toggle switch. You have one or the other, not both. Also note, if I turn my delay up to maximum again, the delay control doesn't affect pulse width modulation. It will still start immediately. That's as per the original design. The third place that we can introduce low frequency oscillation is in the filter bank. So here's our LFO1 slider, turn that up, and now here's the filter quite clearly being modulated. And did you hear the delay? Let's turn the delay back up. No modulation. Period of time before the modulation is introduced. And the fourth place to which LFO1 can be mapped is to the voltage controlled amplifier, basically the volume. Let's have some of that. Bring in some delay, quiet note, and then the oscillation begins. So if I get a little bit more sensible about these values, we can dial in quite a nice tremolo. Tremolo is all about being subtle. You don't want a really radical effect because it's too, it's just too extreme. Tremolo is just a gentle waving. It's almost imperceptible actually, just to get that nice little wobble. Got the control turned almost all the way down. So potentially 4 simultaneous modulation destinations all being driven off the same LFO simultaneously. This is why the Jupiter range of synthesizers were so famous and they're so beloved these days, because you have wonderful musical flexibility. All of this stuff just lends itself to great sounding, really organic synth patches where it's so simple to just get something that sounds just really good straight away. Just by having a little bit of each one of these modulation amounts, I've really not dialed in very much at all. And that is a complex sound. Next, I want to have a chat about this retrig option down at the bottom. Got a retrig control here. I've taken all of the modulation away and I've dialed in a very slow pitch sweep. So as you can see and hear, it's very slowly evolving modulation of pitch. At 0.06, it's going to take about 16 seconds to complete one single cycle of this pitch sweep. Now there's only a single LFO across the entire layer, so we've got 2 layers here, and at the moment we're only dealing in the upper layer, basically like 2 synthesizers sat on top of each other. But this LFO is common to the entire layer. In other words, it doesn't matter how many notes I press, they're all going to use the same LFO. So I'm going to play some octave notes now, and you'll hear that as I introduce new notes, they all basically jump onto the same pitch curve. Now that LFO is completely free spinning. The easiest way to demonstrate a free spinning LFO is to hit the key lots of times, and you'll hear like a join the dots. That LFO doesn't care that I'm pressing the key. It's doing its thing, and I'm simply jumping on the back of it. If I engage retrig, that's not going to be the case. Now every single note will begin the LFO from its beginning. And so I have to hold the note down long enough for you to actually hear that there's a pitch sweep there at all. However, when I go back to playing that multiple octave pattern, you'll hear that all of the other notes after the first note pressed do still jump onto the same wave basically. So there's my first one, and that establishes the LFO and gets it going. But from that point onwards, this LFO is now spinning, and all of the subsequent keys aren't re-triggering it because you've only got one. The moment you let go of all of the keys, the next time you press a note, that'll re-trigger the LFO again. Next up, we've got a sync button, which simply locks it to the host tempo. So now if we hover over the rate control, you can see that it says 1/2 dotted. And we've also got waveform shapes. So if we have a sawtooth wave instead, you're going to get this kind of thing. Speed it up a bit. Classic sci-fi kind of sound, and square is going to be on and off. And it is a square, not a pulse. So we don't have individual control over the pulse width of the LFO's wave. It's fixed at square. Random. Classic computer chatter. LFO2 is based on more of a performance-based kind of concept, because this is all about interacting with the LFO dynamically. In fact, as originally implemented on the machine, you had this big friendly button that you would press in order to manually engage a low frequency oscillator for a period of time. So the outputs of LFO2 aren't as extensive as LFO1. We've got pitch modulation to the VCO and filter. Let's do pitch modulation first. So the VCO is currently cranked up to maximum. If I press a note, you don't hear any modulation until I click and hold down this button. There's the modulation. Now it comes in, you hear it come in slowly. It didn't all happen instantly. That's the rise control. So this rise knob here is similar to the delay, but it's actually more of a uniform introduction rather than the fairly dramatic exponential effect that you get from delay. So let's turn rise all the way down. As soon as I press this button, the oscillation starts. I do like this rise effect, it's really musical. Yeah, that's just about nice, it's a nice ramp. Obviously rate, speed of oscillation, make it faster. There we go. And you can map this button to a MIDI control. I've not spoken about MIDI mapping on this device yet, but basically right click on any control, enter MIDI learn mode. I can now press a button on my hardware, on my keyboard. And this is actually a toggle button, but you can see that's activating the LFO on and off. If you don't want that manual control, you can set it to on, at which point it's effectively behaving in the same way as LFO 1. So you could use these two different oscillators to map to different destinations. It's just extra flexibility. And obviously, if we turn VCO down and VCF up, now it's controlling the filter. And that's the low frequency oscillators covered. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.